Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Can we all hear me? Okay, my name is Ajole Enemari, and I'm a program officer at Global Rights. And I thank you all for joining this session this afternoon. I would like to crave our indulgence to just give others like 5 minutes to start so that when we just give them 5 minutes, we'll start immediately. Thank you very much for your patience. Okay. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Can we all hear me? If you can hear me, please write in the chat box and let us know where you're joining from. I'm guessing that everybody we're coming from different parts of the country and outside the country. So let us know where you're joining from. Okay, Ms. Bumi is already ready. Nice. Okay, so at this point, I would yield the mic to Ms. Olubumi Aweda, the country manager of Global Rights, to give us the welcoming remarks. Ms. Bumi, you have the mic.
Bumi, we can't hear you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry about the audio. So greetings from Global Rights. We've been running this series on communities at the art of mining. We've had our first series on fundamentals of mining host communities, and that session was taken by Ms. Shema Edeb. And we had the last one on women, mining, and community rights. And that session was taken by Ms. Ofodili. And today, I'm particularly excited about this session because this session is being taken by our very own executive director. So this is a series you don't want to miss. This is a model you don't want to miss. So we're going to be diving deeper into the fundamentals of mining host communities. So if you have your friends and colleagues that you think they should be part of this model, please do contact them, send the link to them, tell them to join. So I'll just tell you briefly about Global Right. For the last 30 years, Global Right has been building the capacity of undeserved communities in Nigeria. And we've built platforms for participatory governance, working on the wide range of communities, working on wide range of cross-cutting issues in Nigeria. We have thematic areas around human rights, women's rights, access to justice, climate change, and human rights, civic space strengthening, human security and human rights. And of course, the thematic area that is bringing you this series that we've been running since last month, that's our equitable resource governance. So today we're going to be looking at the bigger picture of mining governance. So since we started this series, we've unpacked the realities of mining governance, the implication for host communities. We've dived deeper into understanding the fundamentals of community rights to examine the gender impact of extractive activities. So today, we have our own executive director, like I said, and then she's going to be zooming in on what the missing pieces are. And then she's going to be breaking down the ECOWAS protocols, the regional safeguards in a simple and practical way. So this series is being supported by our own very donor, Ford Foundation. They've been supporting this project, and would like to say a big thank you to them. So everyone, welcome to class again, and I hope you have an impactful session today. Thank you. AJ, I'll hand over back to you.
All right, thank you very much, Bumi. Like Bumi has mentioned earlier, this session is going to be taken by our very own executive director. This session is meant to focus on regional frameworks, particularly ECOWAS protocols, environmental rights, and safeguards. And ladies and gentlemen, the session will be taken by Mr. Abiodun Baiwu, a human rights attorney and a transformative leader in natural resource governance across West Africa. With over 20 decades of experience, she has pioneered community-led advocacy frameworks that have redefined the relationship between mining host communities, the state, and executive corporations. As the executive director of Global Rights, she has successfully scaled the organization's impact, navigating complex socio-political landscapes to ensure that mineral wealth translates into community development rather than environmental and social crises. In her work on pioneering community-led governance, her vision for grassroots empowerment led to the initiation of the Nigerian Federation of Mining Host Communities, a formidable advocacy body that has grown under her guidance to represent communities across 21 states in Nigeria. This federation serves as a unified voice for the protection of land rights and the demand for equitable benefit sharing. Recognizing the regional nature of extractive challenges, she also initiated the West African Mining Host Communities Indaba, now an annual regional flagship event. The Indaba brings together host communities from across West Africa to exchange strategies, build technical capacities, and co-create solutions to systematic injustice in the sector. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Abiodun Baiwu. Ma, you have the mic.
Thank you very much, AJ, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm looking at the names that are coming up in the chat, and I'm so happy to see good friends and partners to Global Rights and personal friends too. Thank you so much for making the time this afternoon. I don't take it for granted that on a Tuesday afternoon that you would come and that you would listen to us talk. And AJ, hi. AJ said, I've been in this sector for 20 decades. That's 200 years. It is well. There are very few countries that are 200 years old, but AJ has decided that 200 years is what I have done in this industry. So we will be guided by you, AJ. We will see what has happened over the past 200 years. As a matter of fact, let's start the conversation from what happened 200 years ago. Let's just follow AJ's lead. Can I share? I can. Okay. So I'm going to be talking on the fundamentals of mining host community rights today. I think that you can see my screen. Hope you can. We'll be talking about the fundamentals of mining host community rights, and we'll be looking at regional instruments. While we look at regional instruments, I'd also like to look through international instruments. Now, AJ started us off on a very important note. 200 years ago, what was going on 200 years ago? Well, my ancestors were going on 200 years ago. And the things their eyes saw, the things your ancestors saw, and the stories that we were told subsequently, what you see and what you hear will depend on where you're standing, who told you what they told you. And it tells you also a lot about yourself. But what has happened in the past is very important to understanding where we are and understanding where we need to go. How can you tell me where I'm going when you don't even know where I've been? And that is the issue. That is the story of extractives, not only in Nigeria, but across West Africa and across the world. So we've been told many stories about extractives, and we're being given new names on extraction, about critical minerals and precious earth elements. But we really don't know where all this story came from and why this training is very important today. What we do know in this room that it is very important to protect the rights of mining host communities because they're often the most vulnerable communities, the most vulnerable groups of people in a country, particularly in a country like Nigeria or in West African countries. And having traveled most of African countries, I will tell you, in most of Africa, whether it is in Zimbabwe, where I saw great wealth standing right next to great poverty, or in South Africa, where diamonds has only brought poverty to the people, or is it in Ghana, where the earth is yielding toxins and wealth at the same time, or whether you're talking about the DRC, where I saw such abject poverty and yet at the same time, such rich people and such rich earth. Wherever you stand on the continent, it's been a story of pillage, colonial exploitation of what happened on our continent 200 years ago, where AJ had situated me, was business. The objective of colonialism, if we don't understand what happened, was business. They went out there to loot the wealth of nations and enrich their own territories. They went across the world just looking for countries to pillage, and they found countries that were trusting, groups of people that were trusting, groups of people that had great wealth, that sat on great wealth, groups of people that also had their own culture, the way in which they respected the earth. So, for example, we had Forbidden Forest. It was our own way of conserving the environment. There were rules in many communities about falling certain trees. You couldn't fall certain trees, and that if you fall a certain tree, some cultures have that if you fall a certain tree, you have to go through certain rituals and plant back 5 trees or something like that. And so you begin to think about all of this and you think, what happened on our continent and why is what happened important today? So the territories, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, amassed great wealth to itself, as did France, as did Belgium, and with which they built their nation and created intergenerational wealth by which their own children today benefit. And you will find that the pushback of African migrants from those countries is a pushback from the wealth that your forebears, my forebears had created on the continents that of Europe, particularly, that we speak about. Slave trade is another way in which wealth was created, the sale of human chattel. But that is conversation for another day. That is conversation for another training. What we're talking about today is about minerals. We may not be able to cover everything in detail, and that is why this is in series. We've got series up to 3 years, the next 3 years. If we keep talking, we would not have covered everything if we keep talking on a monthly basis. But then we can start. Let's start with the story of Nigeria. The world to them was a business. And today the world is still a business. Nigeria's story. Nigeria was not Nigeria in the proper sense of the word Nigeria. 20 decades ago, according to AJ, 200 years ago, Nigeria was a company. The land was given by the government of the United Kingdom to a company known as the Royal Niger Company. And their job was to loot, pillage, take as much as possible from Nigeria and pay taxes to the United Kingdom. But they started to mess things up, and then the United Kingdom had to take over from them again. And we were not the only country that faced this ordeal. India was called the British East Indian Company and was established in 1600. Indonesia was the Dutch East India Company, was founded in 1602. You're wondering where I'm going with this story and the instruments. Stay with me. Canada was a Hudson Bay Company and was chartered in 1670. Zimbabwe and Zambia was a single territory known as the British South African Company and was founded by Cecil Rhodes. A lot of people are familiar with the name Cecil Rhodes, but then they don't realize the guy was just one good hell of a businessman who took business to the limits. The United States itself, certain territories within the United States was not always the United States. There were just many countries that decided to unite together and become the United States. So, for example, Virginia was a Virginia company founded in 1606 and granted a royal charter who established colonies in North America, and they pillaged North America. I recently taught a history of human rights, and the pillage of North America is one of the worst atrocities that we're yet to confront in reparations across the world. Well, there was a paradigm shift from countries being called businesses or businesses being called countries, because at a point in time, like Animal Farm, we couldn't tell the difference. The European governments and the colonial administration took direct control. The British government decided they would run things themselves. And there are many reasons for this. First, that financial failure. Those businesses were running themselves to the ground. You know, when you allow people to largesse, sub to NNPC and the various companies that our government has floated, and then they've just run to the ground. The cost of maintaining those vast territories and fighting wars, because you see, if you want to steal people's land, you have to fight for it. And those companies did not have the equipment. They didn't have the armies to fight like a country would. There was also imperial consolidation. The monarchies were consolidating direct imperial power and formalizing colonial territory administrations. So you find, for example, in a place like Canada, they were pulling together the various territories within Canada to become a single one. They were trying to join New York, for example, with Virginia, run the taxes and the administrations together. You were finding that the British administration was finding that their territories within Nigeria, Cameroon, because the British were running Cameroon before the French took over, and Ghana were also thinking, how do we begin the Northern Protectorate, the Southern Protectorate, how do we begin to run this thing together in a way that the taxes that we're exerting from them makes sense and build our country, and the resources are not secondhand received from the companies. And so the imperial consolidation was ongoing. There was also outrage, even within those countries, of corporate abuses and corruption. Corruption is not new. Hello, corruption is not a Nigerian thing. The British had created special corruption channels through those special companies like the Royal Niger Company. And this led to a lot of public and political outrage that made the government say, you know what, we'll take over. And so the British administration took over. But the British administration themselves, they don't do well. They really came in and they messed up a lot of things. What did they do? The pillage. If you go to the Congo and you read the stories, you don't even have to go. Read the stories about what happened in the Congo, the human rights atrocities, the killings of people over their own resources. What happened with, and that was by the government of Belgium, what the British administration was doing in Nigeria. And we really need to teach our children and those who come after us the history of our countries, what they were doing in Nigeria, the atrocities, the dethronement of kingdoms. You need to go to Benin. You need to understand what happened with the territory that is called Lagos. You need to also understand what happened with the territory that is called Ife, what happened in the Northern Protectorate, how they ravaged a nation in such a way that we can only call it terror attacks were going on. They left they went away with a lot of things. They went away with our ivory, with our crafts, with our art. They went away with our minerals, gold, copper, tin, cobalt. When you see Jos Plateau, you understand that this is not erosion. This is pillage when you look at the earth. And it's still causing a lot of conflict in that region because the earth can no longer yield what the people need to stay sustainable. They took our coal, they took rubber, palm oil, timber, and all of that. They created forced labor systems where they had hot taxes, enforcing indigenous populations to work for colonial looters, so that part of your tax, since you could not afford to fully pay your taxes, they taxed in such a way that you can't afford to pay your taxes, and part of those taxes were then that men in communities were rounded up to work the mines, to work the rubber plantations, to fulfill the tax quota of communities. They also left environmental degradation. I've spoken to you about the Jos Plateau, and you need to go to other territories across West Africa to understand, across Africa, as a matter of fact, the gullies in South Africa, the things that I have seen across the continent in the way in which they devastated the land, and all because they were extracting minerals that didn't belong to them and belong to the communities. They left in their wake the resource course of mono economies, so that communities, countries were so dependent on the commodities of the natural resources, for example, oil, gold, tin, that they no longer were able to diversify the economy. For economies that had extractions such as rubber plantations kill off ecosystems. And I think that's something people don't understand. So when we also talk about oil palm plantations, that they were killing off ecosystems, they killed off a lot of our ecosystem. We were a rainforest, no longer a rainforest in West Africa, because monocropping ensured that other crops could not be planted, other forms of livelihoods could not be sustained. If you go to the Niger Delta, you realize that the oil spills killed off the mangroves. The death of the mangroves also meant that the ecosystem was killed off. The fish are gone. Nigeria doesn't have fish like Ghana, and yet our coastal line is wider than that of Ghana, and it's all because of the oil that was being exploited there. So there was a spoilage that has left us devastated. Our environment is still trying to rally. And remember, we're very close to the equator, which also makes us very vulnerable to climate change. Combining that with climate change, we have continued to struggle. But there came a turning point. First, that a lot of local movements for independence were going on. Let us run our own show. Let us control our own resources. Let us control our own democracy, or rather, let us have democracy. Let us be participating in our own government. It was also economically unviable for them anymore. Why? Because with World War I and World War II, Europe was thrown into such abject poverty. The amounts that they spent on wars will never make sense. From wherever you look at them, they will never make sense. Economically, socially, they just don't bring good. And Europe learned the hard way with World War I and World War II, so that they were economically unviable. They kept increasing the taxes of the territories including Nigeria, the rest of West Africa, but then that was still not enough to sustain the war, and which made the push for local independent movements to be stronger. There also were superpower pressures, because by then the polarity of the world had begun. The United States, that believed in a liberal worldview, and of course the USSR, that had a socialist purview, were the superpowers, and that the pressures of the superpowers of autonomy were beginning to also push Europe to begin to let go of the territories that did not even belong to them in the first place. And there were also the changing global norms, with the United States as the hegemonious power, as the key power ruling the world. They began to push for the United Nations. And the United Nations itself, the creation of the UN Charter, because also all the atrocities of World War II led to the human rights regime that we now have. We moved into the human rights era, and with the human rights era was also the era of self-determination. So they had to let go, not that they wanted to let go. But the question is, after independence, like countries like Nigeria, 1960, October 1, waving flags, did independence bring freedom? Did it give countries like Nigeria the autonomy it needed to run its resources? Did its people have a say in how its resources were run? Let me put it in more contemporary parlance. Was there free, prior, informed consent once independence was gained? Was there also the ability to control what happens to the environment, what happens to the resources that are beneath the earth or on the earth, such as our plantations, rubber, palm oil, and all of that. Did independence bring freedom? Has the world really changed? Has the world stopped being a business? Do they still treat the earth as a business or a place where God is giving people to live, a place we hold in trust for our children, for our grandchildren, for those who will come after us? We inherited it in trust from our forebears. What are we giving to our children as the world changed? Have we started to look as a world as a place where people live, or is it still a business? We're still in this global north, global south divide where the global north is still heavily, China joined the race a while ago, heavily pillaging what we call, which is still an insult, the global south, meaning those at the bottom, those at the top. But then when you look at the map of the world, it's not always about top, bottom, but in the way in which they think about countries in sub-Saharan Africa as being beneath and still treated as inferior, places where their businesses can run. And they simply rebranded the Royal Niger Company and all of those countries to continue in a manner that is disgusting. So it's corporocracy, not democracy, going on in a lot of countries and in a lot of regions across the world. So we still have central economic actors. We have companies that are richer than countries, that their annual profits are higher than the annual GDP of entire nations. Go and ask them at Apple, drivers of global innovation, and they are the ones who focus the economy on profits and that are ethically challenged. We're still flaring gas in the Niger Delta, in spite of the fact that we know that benzene is killing people, it's giving people cancer. In less than a year, I have lost 3 classmates to cancer. Stop and think of how many people you've lost to those type of diseases that our environments are imposing on us. We continue to live in environments that are being treated as though as collateral damage. The people are treated as collateral damage. What they need is the wealth from the land to enrich the 1% of the 1% that continue to rule the world. Meanwhile, the people who own, in reality, the earth and the minerals on them continue in abject poverty. I will pause for 2 seconds just to catch my breath. And then I see there's a lot going on in the chat. Probably people just putting their names in. Yes, so no questions so far. Very good. Right. So yeah, we're still Ayodeji, we're still a company. Nigeria is still pretty much being run as a business, and a lot of countries are still run as businesses. As a matter of fact, almost every country is still being run as a business, and the majority of people are still disadvantaged. There are fewer middle class in most countries. In countries like Nigeria has successfully eradicated the middle class, and the class that should be the middle class have jackpot because they know the eradication is coming from them. And yet at the same time, poverty is criminalized. And so if you're poor, you are treated like the worst thing that could have happened to the earth. So in the past 70, 80 years, 100 years, if you will, a lot of work has gone into reclaiming our power, our wealth, and our resources as Africans. And it might feel as though we're not doing a lot of this. We are. We're doing so much around that. We're reclaiming our power as a people through domestic laws, reclaiming them through regional instruments, reclaiming them through international instruments. And I'm going to go very quickly over the instruments. Now, I may not be able to go in details. That's why I said Every month we've got something for you. Next year, we will break down this instrument and look line by line into every single one of them. But today, what we're doing is giving a brush stroke of what exists out there and how can we take advantage of them before we even go into the nitty-gritty of them all. So we start with the UN framework for the protection of mining host communities. The most important framework is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the Voluntary Principles for Security and Human Rights. Once upon a time, I was called Madame Voluntary Principles. The ILO Convention number 169, which is very important, and we'll talk about it. The UN Guidance, this is a more recent document, the UN or instrument, the UN Guidance for Action on Critical Energy Transition Minerals. So the UN, at the UN level, we have all of these instruments, apart from the core human rights charters, the civil and political rights, and the UN Charter for Human Rights. We have the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Now, all of this is great. They give a good guide to the world that reminds businesses that people are people and should be treated as people. But what is the downside to all of this is we're trying to create norms around this, but they're not binding. You can't hold them to these instruments. Excuse me. I've already explained what each of these instruments are, and we will share the slides with you if you want them. So I've spoken about all of them, including the ILO Convention on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples' Rights, which strengthens the consultation and participation rights of Indigenous communities. And it is what set the pace for free, prior, and informed consent. And over time, we will look in detail into free, prior, and informed consent and the laws that back it up, and where Nigeria is lacking, or where most African countries are still slacking in the domestication of FPIC provisions into their laws. Now, they're also supporting frameworks and voluntary initiatives at the UN level. The UNEP-FI, that is the United Nations Environmental Protection Financial Initiative Human Rights Toolkit, to guide investors on project compliance with human rights, pretty much like the UN Guiding Principles, but at the UNEP level. The UNEP Mining Policy Framework, also on the protection of the environment, socio-economic governance, to ensure equitable benefits sharing, which is also something that is very lacking. We continue to give the minerals, but we don't get the benefits from the minerals, which is also something that has been very, very lacking in the conversations around protecting mining host community rights, and which we will be paying a lot of focus to this year. Also, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, 80, most of you are familiar with its Nigerian chapter, NATI, and NATI being a foremost one of the very first countries, Nigeria being one of the very first countries to adopt an AT and domesticate the AT, leading to the NATI. And the NATI, let's be honest, in spite of all that has gone on, has actually been very impressive. Nigeria scores at the AT as being good. But at the international level, that works. At the global level, that has worked so far. But we also have regional frameworks. We have the African Charter for Human and People's Rights, which was established, or which came live in 1981. The African Mining Vision, now if I remember, African Mining Vision was 2006, and the ECOWAS Mining Directive. Those are the core regional frameworks that guide us as West Africans around protecting the rights of mining host communities and of ensuring the actualization of Africa's minerals benefiting the people in the territory. And when we narrow even further down, we will see that even Nigerian laws protect the rights of mining host communities. There's a concept, though, we must understand when it comes to regional instruments, particularly for Africa. Now, most of the regional instruments at the UN level point, except for the rights of indigenous people, point at individual rights. But a lot of the African rights are people's rights. They're collective rights. And they're held by a group rather than by individual members of the group. In contrast, individual rights are rights held by individual people, even if their groups are differentiated, which most rights are. They remain individual rights if the right holders are individuals themselves. But for collective rights, it is our rights. It is not my right, it is our right. The fact that we are a people, and like my friend will say, we is people. As long as we is people, as long as we are a people, those rights belong to us. Sometimes they use this to infringe on people's rights, some individual rights, and sometimes they protect individual rights as well. So it's been controversial in some quarters, but for Africans, it's been very important. Now, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights is a forward-thinking document, in spite of what people say. We may not have leaders that are implementing them effectively, but it is a forward-thinking document. And if as Africans we're aware of them, then we will have the benefits. We will be able to pursue the benefits, advocate for our rights, speak for ourselves, and actualize them. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights, and I encourage people, please read these instruments. Don't just be satisfied with people giving you small blurbs of articles and sections in laws. Read them as a whole. They may feel intimidating, especially the way in which lawyers handle them. God bless lawyers. May they make heaven. But that if you read them as a letter written to you saying, this is your right. And I do the same with the Nigerian Constitution. Every once in a while, I will teach a class on the Nigerian Constitution. And I'm always excited about Section 2 of the Constitution. Chapter 2 of the Constitution. Amazing, amazing. Very few countries have as beautiful a constitution as the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. But I digress. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights is another instrument that I love. Article 19 of the African Charter says, all people shall be equal, they shall enjoy the same respect, and shall have the same rights. Africa is not an animal farm where we said all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. This is the opposite of animal farm. All peoples, note peoples and my explanation about group rights. All peoples shall be equal. No ethnic group is greater than the other. No race is greater than the other. They shall enjoy the same respect and they shall have the same rights. Nothing shall justify the domination of a people by another. We end colonialism, we end ethnic bigotry, where we talk about the majority ruling over the minority, that we're all equal. Article 20 says, all people shall have the right to existence. The right to exist is a human right within the African context. They shall have the unquestionable and inalienable right to self-determination. You can choose what you want to do with yourselves. They shall freely, they shall freely determine their political status and shall pursue their economic and social development according to the policy that they are freely chosen. Let that sink in. At the back of, on the other side of your mind, I want you to think about FPIC. All people shall have the right to existence. This is how we want to exist. They shall have the unquestionable. You don't have the right to question how they decided to live. And inalienable rights to self-determination. You can't take away their right to self-determination. They shall freely determine their political status and shall pursue the economic and social development according to the policy that they've so freely chosen. If they decide we don't want the coal to be mined from our community, Dadani, leave it. That's their choice. If they decide that they want plantations, very well, continue. If they decide that they want this form of development, but not that form of development, that they will not define development in the way in which the West defines development, that's fine. That is what they've chosen. Let them be. It is their right as a peoples, all peoples, as a peoples. So colonized or oppressed people shall have the right to free themselves from the bonds of domination by resorting to any means recognized by the international community. And yes, there's neo-colonialism, so we need to not think that this ended with the liberation of Namibia, that we are still dealing with a lot of colonial rule on our continent and even in our country, Nigeria. All people shall have the right to the assistance of the state's parties to the present charter in their liberation struggle against foreign domination, be it political, economic, or cultural. No people have a right to bring and impose their own political system, their economic ideals, or their cultural norms on a people. You might say that begins to infringe. Again, I spoke about individual rights and collective rights. Maybe infringe on individual rights when a person decides this is what I want, but then the person's peoples have decided that they want otherwise. But think about it also in terms of our natural resources and the way in which those resources are being harnessed. Article 21 says that all peoples shall freely dispose of their wealth and natural resources. This right shall be exercised in the exclusive interest of the people, and in no case shall a people be deprived of it. In case of spoliations, the dispossessed people shall have the right to the lawful recovery of its property as well as to an adequate compensation. So all the things that they have stolen from our continent, we have a right to recover them. That was spoliation. All of the museums across the world holding African artifacts, holding the gold, holding the minerals, all the places where the diamonds and the great stones that are done in the crowns of certain kings and queens and places and libraries and museums. We have a right to repossess them according to the African Charter. The free disposal of wealth and natural resources shall be exercised without prejudice to the obligation of promoting international economic cooperation based on mutual respect, equitable exchange, underline equitable exchange, and the principles of international law. State parties to the present charter shall individually and collectively exercise the right to free disposal of their wealth and natural resources with a view to strengthening African unity and solidarity. State parties to the present charter shall undertake to eliminate all forms of foreign economic exploitation, particularly that practiced by international monopolies. Shall on my mind, and as to enable their people to fully benefit from the advantages derived from their natural resources. Article 22. All peoples, I always call that in the singular, but it's the plural. All peoples shall have their rights to the economic, social, and cultural development with due regard to their freedom and identity, and in the equal enjoyment of the common heritage of mankind. States shall have the duty, individually or collectively, to ensure the exercise of the right to development. Article 24. All peoples shall have a right to a general, satisfactory environment favorable to their development. All people have their rights to the economic, social, and cultural development. All people have the rights to national and international peace and security. All people have a right to a general and satisfactory environment favorable to their development. Again, all peoples have a right to the economic, social, and cultural development. One, all people have the right to national and international peace and security. Two, all people have the right to a general and satisfactory environment favorable to their development. So if your environment is not favoring, your development, then problem D, there's a problem. That means that the African Charter, oh, the sound is echoing. Maybe it's something to do with your mic. Okay, so all peoples have a right to satisfactory environments. Now, I'm going to take a pause because I think I saw a question. Do other continents have to adhere to our regional charters? What recourse do Africans have when these rights are infringed? Well, they must abide, because if you come into my territory, you do not, I will deal with you in the way in which the laws of my territory says I should deal with you. So we will no longer allow you, which means that we have put out a legal instrument that says we are not for sale. A friend and I used to have a joke about Mr. Saleh, so that when you walk down the street, you see a house, you see for Saleh. You walk by your car, you see for Saleh. Well, we're no longer for Saleh in Africa, that you have to abide by the rules of Africa, because we have decided as a people, this is who we are and this is what we want. Who we are and what we want is not just to interests that are foreign to Africa. It's also a binding instrument that holds our governments in their sovereignty, their great sovereignty, that even within their sovereignty have agreed, we will abide by these rules. We wouldn't allow people to come in and do this to us. If they come, then it's an act of aggression and an act of war when they come at us like that. I wanted to quickly spotlight people's rights to development, and maybe in one of the, I know all the sessions for this year have been set, maybe a session next year that we could spotlight on the right to development and really, dissect what the rights to development is internationally, regionally, and within Nigeria, and see how that goes. Article 22 of the African Charter, I think it's section Article 22, section 2, subsection 2, that provides that people have a right to development, and it implies that the people as right holder may be a community, population of the country as a whole, or everyone living on the African continent. The right to development places an obligation on the government to address developmental disparities within the country. Oh my goodness, 1 hour gone. Implies that the government must use public resources for public good. And we will see that in the Nigerian constitution. You find it as well in the African Mining Vision and the ECOWAS Mining Directive. So this echoes through. Now, this right are echoed, in the Nigerian constitution, chapter 2 in particular, clearly articulates the right to development as a community right. So development is first and foremost a change in the quality of life, and not only an economic growth. So the Western ideal of development being economic growth rather than improvement in the quality of life, doesn't have a place within the way in which Africa perceives itself. That development is first and foremost a change in the quality of life and not in economic growth, which means that the full development of every man or woman within their community is in the way that it is being freely chosen by that community. This is what level of development in quotes we want, or type of development that we want within our community. That's up to you. So from the perspective of the African Charter, the overall conception of human rights is marked by the right to development. And it integrates all of the economic, social, and cultural rights and the civil, political rights, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights together. It gives you a full picture of people being able to determine who they want to be. And by detracting from the social and economic development of the people, the population as a whole, government corruption, for example, constitutes a violation of the people's right to development, and the government as well in corruption, in state capture. And I think rather than, I should have written state capture instead of corruption. State capture, where certain people decide this is where we go, hey, this is what we do, is itself a violation of people's rights to development. Implicit in people's rights to development is free, prior, and informed consent. And you will always find that free, prior, and informed consent will find its way into every single session that we have on protecting mining host community rights. You cannot protect rights that you have not even acknowledged or respected. First right is that you allow people to be who they choose to be. You allow them to choose how the life goes with them. Now, you find the right to free, prior, and informed consent as a developmental right in Article 16 of the ECOWAS Mining Directive, the African Charter if you read combined, and I've just read to you Article 19 to 24. If you combine all of them together, you read them together, you get a great sense of the right to development. And there have been cases that have been taken to the African courts on the African Charter, African Courts for Human and People's Rights, recognizes, for example, CERAC and the Center for Economic and Social Cultural Rights against Nigeria. I'm trying to rush a bit because I realized I've used up 1 hour. I was just gisting. So this was about the Ogoni people taking the Nigerian government to the African courts. And it was decided they recognized the Ogoni people as a people in terms of the African Charter, and found that as a result of its involvement in oil production in Ogoni land, the Nigerian government violated the Ogoni people's right to property, Article 14, natural resources in Article 21, and to a satisfactory environment suitable to their development in Article 24, among other rights. The court also found that the government violated the right to adequate housing, stating that the African Charter implicitly recognizes this right along with the associated right to protection from forced evictions. I pause again on protection from forced evictions because of Lagos State and River State as well, but more recently that Lagos has become so bad with forced evictions and the right to development, the right to free, prior, and informed consent. Because when you think about communities like the Kondo Bambe, that they've been there for centuries. Pre-colonially, these communities were there. But the marking points, again, I note that poverty is criminalized in countries like Nigeria, where they're being displaced and businesses are building skyscrapers where this communities once existed. If you lived in Nigeria in the 80s, you know the demolition of Makoko and what has now become areas around Lagos Island. I need to remember what all those estates are called, were sandfield. Those communities were raised off sandfield, and now they are, I think Foresight Estate is one estate that I remember. Maroko, thank you. And more recently now, they're after Makoko, and all those estates around Victoria Island and Ikoyi in particular were then raised from the ashes of lands that were stolen from peoples, and their rights to self-determination also stolen. Now, what the African Court then recommended to the Nigerian government was to ensure adequate environmental and social impact assessments and independent oversight bodies for petroleum industry, as well as providing information on health and environmental risk and meaningful access to regulatory and decision-making bodies to communities likely to be affected by oil operations. I didn't tell the story of Ogoni because I believe most people on the call should know of Ogoni, and I'm sorry that I was rushing. But then the Ogoni community had taken the Nigerian government to court because of the pollution of the land, the spoilage of the land, and the pollution from the oil extraction that had killed off the mangroves, destroyed livelihoods, and was affecting the health of people living there. And the Nigerian government has simply claimed that no be we nah, we've contracted this off to Shell, and the rest is history. And Nigeria doesn't walk alone. So, for example, also in the Androids case, the Androids Welfare Council that had also taken the Kenyan government to court. Why? Because they were being forcibly removed from their land, from their ancestral land around Lake Bogoria, I believe it was, to create a game reserve. You remove people who have lived there for centuries to create a game reserve in the name of development. So the African court found that by forcibly removing the Androids people from their ancestral land around Lake Bogoria to create a game reserve, the government of Kenya violated the Androids' right to property, a people's right to property, to their land. Article 14, to natural resources, Article 21, right to development, Article 22, rights to religion, Article 8, right to culture, Article 17, which are very, very common things that communities are deprived of when mining concerns move into their country. Now, the African courts noted in particular that the Androids are an indigenous community and a people, and that for any development or investment project that would have a major impact within the Androids territory, the state has a duty not only to consult with the community, but also to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent according to their customs and traditions. So that was up to the people. And the court also found that the displacement of the Androids was disproportionate, because I know there are people thinking at the back of their mind, public interest, that, the government keeps taking over land for public interest. After all, it's for public interest. The court found that the displacement of the Androids was disproportionate to any public need served by the game reserve created, and that the encroachment is not proportionate to any public need and is not in accordance with national and international law. So the takeover of Morocco, pause and think, was the takeover of Morocco worth the public need of enriching billionaires further? Like I say, countries are still being treated as businesses. Is the takeover of Utondo Bambe, the eradication of an entire people and their culture, proportionate to public need in Lagos State? The displacement of people sometimes is not just about government coming physically and displacing them. Sometimes it's like what's going on in Kogi State, in our community, where coal mining is causing a lot of pollution and water is being polluted, or that you have in Gombe State, where Lafarge has polluted the water in the community. And so therefore, people will consider moving from those communities because they've been displaced. That's displacement. You might call it secondary displacement, but the government knew what they could do to have prevented that displacement in the first place. Kenya is very rich in this type of laws, and I wish that Nigeria no go carry last in this case and will lead more in taking a lot more of these cases to court. In a similar case, the Ogek people in Kenya, the court decided that the Ogek community faced the risk of irreparable harm if evicted from their traditional lands in the Mau forests. You cannot replace the culture of a people when you physically remove them from their ancestral land. Land, let's also be clear about what land is. Land in Western parlance is wealth. Land in African parlance is spiritual. It is where the umbilical cords of our ancestors are buried. It is why people will sell off their property to ensure that their cousin that died abroad is brought back home and buried where his umbilical cord was buried. Land is where we believe our ancestors were drawn from and returned to, and where we will go to meet them. So land is spiritual in our context. So once you take people off of their ancestral land in the context of Africa, more often than not, you are destroying their culture and their tradition. The Ogek were determined to be an indigenous minority group, and this highlights the risk of violation of the Ogek's right to culture, protection of traditional values, the right to property, and the right to development, among other things. I'm going to move very quickly to African Mining Vision. I will not go in as much detail in the African Mining Vision because that will be for another class. We'll focus purely on the African Mining Vision in another class, and we'll have a lot of fun doing that because there's a lot to unpack in the African Mining Vision. Now, the African Mining Vision's strategic framework was adopted in 2009. I had said 2006. I think that's when the conversations around the African Mining Vision has started, but the framework was adopted in 2009. The African Minerals Development Center serves as a specialized agency overseeing the implementation of the African Mining Vision. I'll call it from this point AMV. And is aimed at unearthing mineral resources for sustainable, inclusive development, moving away from simple extraction to resource-based industrialization. It also protects host communities by ensuring environmental safety, enhancing local economic linkages, protecting artisanal miners, and upholding free, prior, and informed consent, yet again in the rights of people. So what are the key tenets of the African Mining Vision? One, optimal exploitation, promoting the transparent, equitable, and optimal exploitation of mineral resources to overcome the paradox of mineral wealth alongside poverty. So that when we say if we decide we will draw minerals out of our land at all, let it benefit the people. Let's get the maximum benefit from it. Let it not be that gold that is extracted at 500 naira per nugget in this community and then sold for $5,000 in another place is what our lot has continued to be. There's also structural transformation, creating local, national, and regional linkages, beneficiation, manufacturing, infrastructure, rather than just exporting raw materials. And that's very, very common in African countries, particularly in Nigeria, that we don't improve the minerals at all. We dig them out, we send them out. We dig them out, we send them out. And the lack of beneficiation reduces the value that we could have derived from them. Also, the AMV recognized the need to develop local capacity, fostering knowledge-driven skilled African workforce, utilizing regional infrastructure and strengthening local resources, and improving governance, ensuring fair fiscal regimes to curb illicit financial flows and ensure fair tax revenues from these resources. So how is the AMV protecting the rights of mining host communities? Well, by upholding rights, it supports the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, also enforcing high environmental, social, and cultural protection standards to maintain a sustainable quality of life. I'm aware of certain researchers that are working on the right to exist, not just as a human right, because that's a very, very African right, but as an environmental right, that the earth has a right to exist, and humans with their business minds cannot come and destroy the entire earth. So enforcing high environmental, social, and cultural protection standards to maintain a sustainable quality of life, to ensure that the earth itself can breathe, the poor can breathe, the earth can breathe, you know. Empowering artisanal miners, because that's where a lot of the indigenous people are. How do we recognize and support artisanal and small-scale miners? As you know, most of West Africa, it's artisanal mining. In Nigeria, 80% of mining is artisanal, to ensure that we are able to support them in a way that is sustainable to the environment and helps to grow the local economy and improves livelihood without the destruction that usually comes with artisanal mining. Ensuring local benefits, promoting side stream, we talk about upstream and downstream, side stream linkages to ensure infrastructure, water, power, roads, rail, and economic gains are shared with the surrounding communities from where minerals are being extracted. He also promotes gender equality. It advocates for gender justice and the active participation of women in the mining sector. Very quickly, driving closer home, the ECOWAS Mining Directive. The ECOWAS Mining Directive was adopted in 2009, and it applies to all ECOWAS member states. Now, while it was adopted in 2009, it expected that all member states would have domesticated it by 2014. Another story, another day. But Ghana, shout out to Ghana, they no carry last, and hopefully if we push hard, Nigeria will not carry last. It sets minimum standards for mining governance, and it promotes sustainable development, transparency, environmental protection, and economic rights aligned with national laws within the African Mining Vision. And its key goals include strengthening local benefits, regulating artisanal mining, and fostering responsible mineral governance. It focuses on human rights, environmental protection, and community participation. But why are the directives important? The ECOWAS Mining Directive, that is. One, it protects community rights to land and resources. It also requires consultation and consent. Free, prior, and informed consent is specifically spelled out in the ECOWAS Mining Directive. It also promotes benefit sharing. It holds governments and companies accountable. There are also provisions on it on the environment. Article 15 of Chapter 6, particularly of the African Mining Directive, is very critical to the protection of mining community rights. Article 15 in Chapter 6 calls for the respect and promotion of human rights. Article 16, again, the right to development, to ensure free, prior, and informed consent. It provides for mining companies, governments, and mining-related business entities to respect and promote the recognized human rights, including the rights of women and children and workers. They must respect rights of local mining communities, and member states must make adequate provision for the progressive realization of economic, social, and cultural rights and the empowerment of women. Mining companies are to strictly comply with member state laws on the prohibition, carrying, and use of arms. And that pointing to this is very critical when you also think about the voluntary principles on security and human rights. And we spoke about that in the beginning as one of the UN instruments on protecting the rights of mining host communities. The UN, the voluntary principles on security and human rights has a very interesting history. As a matter of fact, it has a Nigerian history. The voluntary principles came about after the killing of Ken Saro-Wiwa by the Nigerian government. We go back again to the Ogoni people and the Ogoni Nine, and through the instigation of Shell International. Now, when Ken Saro-Wiwa was killed, and it was very obvious, well, not only Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 other activists within the community were falsely accused and killed, it was very obvious to all and the international community that business has gone too far. Yet again, the world being treating the earth as business. And it was decided that we can't continue like this. You can't carry the armed forces of a country to intimidate its people on their own land, to loot the land, and then on top of it all, kill off the people for this reason. And so that's how the Voluntary Principles for Security and Human Rights was created. And for a long time, Global Rights was a champion for West Africa. We were able to get the government of Ghana to sign on to the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights. Nigeria has dragged its feet. The local Voluntary Principles Committee is there. But the good news is that the National Human Rights Commission's Human Rights National Action Plan incorporates the voluntary principles on security and human rights and also the UN guiding principles on security and human rights. If you want a government to do something, put it in a book. So that has happened. Yeah, sorry, sometimes I enjoy talking about these things too often, and now I've lost track of where I was. The ECOWAS Mining Directive in Chapter 6 also calls for the respect of community rights and development, in which people are entitled to participate, contribute, and enjoy social, cultural, political development in a sustainable manner. To respect the rights of local communities to own, occupy, develop, control, protect, and use their land, other natural resources, and cultural and intellectual property. Companies are to obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of local communities before exploration at each subsequent phase and post-mining operations, and must maintain consultations and negotiations on important decisions affecting local communities throughout the mining cycle. Now, what's FPIC itself? We keep talking about FPIC all of the time. It's not too much to go over what FPIC is. One, FPIC is freedom from manipulation or coercion. Prior occurs in advance of any activity associated with the decision being made and allows adequate time for traditional decision-making processes. Informed facilitates the sharing of objective, accurate, and easily understandable information. Consent allows communities to approve or reject a project. There's an organization I love called the Right to Say No. Right to Say No is doing amazing work on FPIC. And we must all begin to make a greater push for FPIC. Now, member states and companies and CSOs and other stakeholders shall establish participatory frameworks, including all actors, to ensure collaboration and peaceful cohabitation during and post-mine operations. Member states are to cooperate with other stakeholders while taking decisions on mining activities. They just don't decide and just move without consultation. They are also to set up socio-economic development fund company and other stakeholders are to contribute for development of post-mine conversion activities in affected communities. Again, I will make a special shout out to the Minerals and Mining Committee at the National Assembly. I am aware of some of the provisions of the new law that they're proposing, and this particular section and also some language on FPIC are being included in what they have. But then so far, so good. Nigeria, no try, plus African Mining Vision, plus ECOWAS Mining Directive. Our laws are behind. Don't let anyone deceive us and tell you that the Minerals and Mining Act of 2007 is a beautiful piece of work. It doesn't respect the rights of the communities from which the minerals are being harnessed. You can tell me, oh, it makes provisions on CDA, but then it doesn't need the approval of the communities to come in. It just says, okay, we'll agree with you, and I will, in quotes, improve your community. And so there is a real problem with enforcing the ECOWAS Mining Directive and also the legal domestication of the Mining Directive and the AMV. One of the things we can, of course, easily do or should do, not just as Nigeria, and this is why the Federation of West African Mining Host Communities is very important, is for us to go to the ECOWAS courts and say our countries are messing up. Oh yeah, and give them advice. We just ratified the MV in Nigeria. Oh no, we haven't. We are till the National Assembly itself does so. I'm not buying it. So the Nigerian Constitution also provides for the protection of Minerals and Mining Act. On what's happening in Zamfara, Adicom. Let me just quickly finish this. We're almost at the end. I'll talk about Zamfara. Zamfara is one of the places that's very, very dear to me. I love Zamfara. And to see what is happening there, I can no longer go to Zamfara. Isn't that wild? We'll talk about Zamfara, but Nigerian Constitution, let's come closer home. We're not going to the other instruments today. We'll just stop at the Constitution. Now, Chapter 2, I've told you that I have a romance with Chapter 2 of the Nigerian Constitution. Section 14(2)(b) and C says that the security and welfare of the people shall be the primary purpose of government, and the participation of people in their government is guaranteed. Now, the security and let me just, if we stop on that part, that security and welfare of the people in the primary purpose of government, that we will see that the Nigerian government is lacking badly when it comes to mining host communities. Where's the security and where's the welfare? We will release very shortly a report on security and mining across Nigeria. And that is the WhatsApp group that Zamfara falls in, Zamfara, Niger, Kaduna, Plateau, Benue. People will be surprised I'm adding Benue to mining and violence. It's part of what's going on in Benue. Taraba, the violence in Taraba is really, really about the minerals, let's be honest. Niger State is just suffering. And we must talk about these things. And the government must also hold itself accountable, because the security and welfare of its people is the primary purpose. If you don't fulfill that purpose, now what we gain from government? Now the participation of people in their government goes again to free, prior, and informed consent. People have to decide, people can decide how they will be governed. People have a say in their government, in the way their minerals are being governed. That's section 14(2)(b) and C. Now, section 17(2)(e) of the Constitution, says that the exploitation of human or natural resource in any form whatsoever for reasons other than the good of the community shall be prevented. I read again, section 17(2)(d). Sorry, I wrote E. I don't even know how I got there, but it's D. exploitation of human or natural resources in any form whatsoever for reasons other than the good of the community shall be prevented. And section 20 says, the state shall protect and improve the environment and safeguard the water, air, and land, forest, and wildlife of Nigeria. The state shall protect and improve the environment and safeguard the water, the air, the land, the forest, and wildlife of Nigeria. So the Nigerian Constitution actually makes those provisions. Now, maybe I'll talk about Zamfara before we go to how to actualize this instrument. Excuse me, I'll just drink a little water. AJ didn't buy me Zobo, so I have to drink water. And she knows I like green tea. She likes green tea too, but she didn't give me any, so it's all good. Zamfara is a very sad story. The very first time I went to Zamfara was in 2010, 2011, and it was at the height of the gold mining related lead poisoning that was going on. And at that time, government was battering blame between the state government and the federal government of who was responsible, who should remediate. The federal government is responsible for of minerals below, state government for the land above. Meanwhile, people were dying. More than 700 children died in Zamfara through that episode. And while that was going on, we were warning that this will happen in other states because of the alluvial stream from Zamfara runs in that same, gold lead mixture all the way to Ebonyi. It goes Zamfara, goes through Kaduna, goes through all the way down Niger, passes down all the way to Ebonyi, and even all the way to Cross River. That alluvial stream is there. There's also it branches also to Osun State. Very, very interesting stream. But then the mixture changes, higher concentration of gold, lead, upper north, and then it becomes gold reduces as it goes all the way down, more lead, less gold, till you get all the way to the lead mining in Ebonyi, where you realize that there's still some gold even in the lead in Ebonyi. And while this was going on, we advised the government that this is a human rights issue. What had happened was that Chinese miners had come into the country. They bought milling machines because they wanted the locals to produce, artisanal miners to produce faster. They took the milling machines home and were milling the nuggets they got from the fields at home. Two reasons why they were milling the nuggets they got at the field at home. One was, they wanted to continue to work after working hours, late into the night, pounding the nuggets to derive and amalgamate the gold. The second reason was the violence had started even way back then. And, we were witnessing things like miners being buried alive and their nuggets being stolen, raids from neighboring communities in Niger into communities in Zamfara State. They will cross over again. There will be counterattacks. The violence has started. The violence didn't just start now. The Libyan war made things worse. And all of this continued. Now, while this was going on, was around the time we were advocating voluntary principles for security and human rights. Now, while that we were advocating for the Nigerian government to adopt the voluntary principles for security and human rights, and in the same breath, I was telling them that Zamfara is particularly vulnerable because of the conflicts in the northeast is driving terrorists down to the northwest, and that the minerals will be used for terror. But you must ensure that you also adopt the voluntary principles on security and human rights, and that you must show up security in these communities. I was called an alarmist, Mr. Lain Muhammad being one of them. At that material point in time, I wanted to be wrong. It wasn't. And many more people had died because our government failed to take charge and ensure peace in Zamfara. Now, what could the government have done? Very big question. First, the government could have ensured that they formalized mining in that place. So people were not mining underground, that we knew who was mining what. That, first of all. Second, that they could have ensured security within those communities, realizing the vulnerability of the borders and also the vulnerability to terrorists that were fleeing the northeast and were also fleeing what was going on in Mali and in Libya. And where, of course, you know that our borders are more than porous. We're able to bring arms in and also violence along with it. That this could have been addressed a long time ago, but rather they also decided that fraternizing and negotiating with terrorists was something that they could do. It's turned really ugly because also there's the added implication of the political cycles, the electoral cycles, where people who sell violence, merchants of violence, during elections have to have other jobs that they do in off-season, election off-seasons, and they continue to sell violence through the kind of work they do with mining or in attacking communities. And so, yes, this has continued. Zamfara is a very sad case. And the question is, how can we begin to draw Zamfara back from the edge? Not just Zamfara, Niger. I'm very, very worried about Niger, about Kaduna, about the Jos Plateau, because the war going on in Jos, as you know, has transcended other farmer communities, as well as in Taraba and in Benue State. There's a question here, given the gaps you've highlighted between existing acts and community consent, what actionable steps can we realistically push at the ECOWAS level to ensure community approval is mandatory? Kwara, please, Kwara State, forgive me for not adding Kwara. Kwara also, because of the lithium, the communities are being heavily attacked. And sometimes, let's also be honest, the laws didn't envisage this type of violence to the pillage of the land. And it's very, very sad. So the question goes straight to what we need to do next. What are go green movements? One, we need to create shadow reports to the UN of the way in which, yes, or Bauchi has been as old as what's going on in Plateau State. I'll come back to the charts later, but let's quickly talk about how we can actualize this instrument. One, we need to create shadow reports to the UN of what's going on in our country, what's going on in our territory, in spite of all of these UN instruments, that our countries are not complying. International shame is what a lot of governments still, well, apart from the government of the United States, is what a lot of governments still try to avoid. The government of Nigeria hates international embarrassment. And so shadow reports to the UN are also very critical. We need to approach the African courts. We see our friends in Kenya do it so well. Kenya, any small thing like this, bam, Kenya has carried briefcase and has faced African courts. Meanwhile, we're closer to the courts, So I think that we should do a bit more of approaching the African courts about a lot of the issues of the violation within our own countries by our own governments. We also need to approach the ECOWAS court. The ECOWAS court most of its sitting is done in Abuja. So imagine we have them there freely, openly, and they've welcomed us a number of times and have told us, hey, when you're ready, we're here. And so we must begin to think, particularly I speak to the Federation of Nigerian Mining Host Communities and the Federation of West African Mining Host Communities, that we must approach the ECOWAS court, particularly for the domestication of the ECOWAS Mining Directive. Otherwise, this FPIC thing, na play. We must also have campaigns for the domestic, I've just spoken about ECOWAS Mining Directive and the AMV, but then we must also challenge chapter 2 of the Nigerian Constitution in the courts and say, yes, they're progressive rights, but what progress is the Nigerian government making? It seems like regression rather than progress. So we must also approach the local courts about chapter 2 of the Constitution, but not be everything be courts. Let's also engage the Ministry of Solid Minerals, the Ministry of Environment, the National Assembly, excuse me, and the presidency about this knowledge that we've gained to say, you know, do it, and you feel do better, and let's keep the conversation going. One thing about the Nigerian spirit is the we no go gree spirit. Let's keep the we no go gree spirit going. So thank you. Madam AJ, I have put my 200 years experience out now. So
Thank you very much, man. Your experience sounded more like 200 years. It sounded like a lot. And we're really grateful. And like you said, you are urging us to engage all government institutions and also to engage the international court and engage all other international institutions. And I totally agree with you, ma. So at this point, I'd like to ask if there's anyone that has questions. You can just raise your hand in the chat box, or you can ask your questions and I'll read it out. Just a few more minutes for question and answers.
oh, I see something here. It says, I can say that the ECOWAS as a regional body are beautifully crafted laws that are supposed to be guiding member nations' rights. Over time, it has seemingly failed in her operations and can be referred to as a toothless bulldog. So how can we enhance its members in terms of protecting our minerals from individuals or companies that only obtain the CDA agreements from the cadastral office without prior notice of the community? Case study play 2. Agreed. Thank you, Ayodeji. Thank you for everyone who thinks this was insightful. So how can we give teeth to the ECOWAS courts? By being the people of ECOWAS. One of the things that's divided ECOWAS is language, that we don't speak the same language. The language barrier and the fault of the language barrier, let me be honest, is a Nigerian fault. We are our francophone brothers and sisters make an effort in learning a bit of English. But Nigerians, because we domineer West Africa, we are West Africa, we just don't even bother. That's the language we speak. We speak English and we don't learn French. That is not the way to go. But if we as a people and thank God, AI is helping people come together more, speak the same language, understand each other. If we as a people are able to take ECOWAS on, create, for example, the Federation of West African Mining Host Communities can create a forum that is focused on ECOWAS and making ECOWAS work for West Africans and not just West African governments. So thank you so much, Ajia Zubeida. It's very nice of you to attend. Okie dokie. AJ, just in case you have questions, stop. That's what I saw in the chat.
Okay, ma, I don't see any more questions. Yeah, I can't see any more questions. Okay, I just saw a question now. Can the community rights as enshrined in the mentioned rights framework be challenged under the Fundamental Human Rights Enforcement Procedure rules in the high courts in Nigeria? That's the question.
They can.
Okay.
They can. You would need to link them up with local existing laws. One of the bigger problems is domestication. But the good thing is that our laws are structured in a way in which you can latch on those laws, those instruments that we've agreed on to them when you are at the courts to make them richer.
Okay. All right, thank you very much, ma. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Adedeji.
Okay, so someone has a comment, not a question. Said, right to participation. Communities should be involved in decision-making process about mining activities affecting their lands and livelihoods. Rights to benefit sharing. Communities are entitled to fair benefits from mining activities such as royalties, employment, and infrastructure development. Environmental protection. Mining companies must minimize environmental harm and ensure sustainable practices. So I don't see any more questions, just comments. Just to say that we'll be dropping the link to the survey in the chat box, but also that it will come to your mail at the end of the session. So, and there's a Ms. Zubeida, you asked for training slides from the last session. I'll try to send that to you. Although if you had attended, everybody that attended got it, but I'll send it to you.
I will address Ibuku Omololu asks, where do we begin? What role can we play or corporately do as citizens? Begin with knowledge, gather more knowledge. One of the things that is critical and we often miss in the building blocks of ensuring rights, of actualizing rights, is community organizing, helping others around you to understand and join in the fight. We also underutilize the courts. I've spoken about the ECOWAS court, the African courts, the local courts, that we need to do more of the courts, and also the international fora. The UN Forum on Business and Human Rights goes on annually. Even the African Forum on Business and Human Rights has become a staple now, and that we must engage those forums so that we keep our eyes not just internally, but also externally to fight what's going on internally.
Right. Thank you very much, ma. Also to let everyone know that you can find recordings of this session and other sessions on YouTube too, just in case you missed it, so you can find them online. The survey link is already in the chat box.
Oga Savior Akpan, happy 5 New Years, sir. You should know more about the voluntary principles than most people on the call. So yeah. There's a final question. Ayodeji Okewumi asks, at the grassroots leadership level, how do we manage community leadership that effectively sell out their communities by taking bribes from multinationals and turn a blind eye to the pillage and the pollution? A lot of times working with communities, the truth is that a lot of community leaders just have no idea of what the rights of their communities are. They feel helpless. The government has already sent them anyway. I might as well get what I can, and can what I get is what happens. By educating a lot more of the leaders and citizens within the communities who are able to hold their leaders accountable would be the way to go. And ensuring it's basically that if more people know what the rights are, if more people also know what's going on in Abuja, how to find out who has who has a license and who doesn't, and how much minerals they can take from the land, that this also begins to help us. So transparency and knowledge are critical to managing community leadership. Community organizing, when one person cannot go after the community chief, but then that if we organize ourselves as an entire group, we can take that despondent community chief down easily. So, oh yes, our communities need this education, and we try within our best at Global Rights to go into the most vulnerable communities, mining communities, and also do this trainings. One of the things we will also do is also do recordings in languages and ensure that people are able to have these recordings and understand what their rights are. Who's calling me auntie over there? You want to age me? You want to turn me into 200-year-old woman? Don't join AJ. AJ has beef for me, everybody. So don't join AJ in aging me 200 years. I'm not even half of that. I forgive Asha. All right. Thank you. AJ, over to you.
And thank you very much, ma, for giving me, and thank you for this really wonderful session. And to the person that asked about sharing the video, yeah, you can share it with your network. So we do encourage that you please share both the video and resources that you would get from the training so that the knowledge spreads as far as we can all carry it. And okay, I would like to say thank you very much. I don't know, Ma, if you have any other concluding thoughts or whether I should just draw the curtain.
Oh yeah. So I actually, Zubaida, we have from those states, and we also do training in those states. We just decided to open it up, which is why we're doing the Zoom series. These recordings are also available on the Global Rights YouTube page. So you can go to the page. You don't need our permission to go there. Like and share, subscribe to our YouTube page. I'm plugging for Jason, and I hope that he will buy me corn and ube after this for plugging for him. So our YouTube page, if you go on YouTube, just put in Global Rights Nigeria, it'll bring up our videos. We have more than 100 videos on our YouTube page. Work and partner with us. AJ is my madam. Just shoot us an email. AJ, if you share your email address in the chat, they can contact you if you want to do some work with us. All right, so thank you very much, AJ. I sign out again. The responsibility of ensuring that the earth we inherited is passed on to our children is ours. It's not a responsibility that we should take lightly. It's not a responsibility I take lightly. I don't want to go to the grave and my ancestors just hiss once they see me, like, you mean you couldn't do better? Don't let your ancestors hiss when they see you, and don't let your children's children wonder, you mean that they couldn't do better? Don't. Just don't. We're the in-between generation. Don't. All right. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Ma. So at this point, we will close the curtain, and I hope that as we enjoy this session, we will all stay tuned in and be on the lookout for the next session, which will be also another impactful session. Just to say that you can follow her on LinkedIn too and social media platforms, please, so that you can engage. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much, and do have a lovely evening. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.